Coach Jackson was a dedicated man who always gave his all to his students, but not everyone appreciated his efforts. When a racist parent starts to complain about him, questioning why a black coach should be working at the school, Jackson finds himself at the center of a storm he never expected. What was it about this parent's complaint that set off such a powerful chain of events? And how did the school's shocking response change everything for Jackson and the community? Let's dive in and find out. But before we jump into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this tale of courage and resilience, don't forget to subscribe. The sun was setting over Oak Ridge Middle School's soccer field, casting long shadows across the grass as a group of young athletes hustled through their drills. The air was filled with the sound of sneakers squeaking on turf, balls being kicked, and the occasional shout of encouragement. At the center of it all stood Coach Marcus Jackson, his keen eyes watching every move his players made. "Come on, Noah. You've got this." Coach Jackson called out to a boy who was dribbling the ball between cones. "Remember, keep your head up and use the inside of your foot." Noah nodded, his face set in concentration as he maneuvered the ball with more control. Coach Jackson smiled, proud of the progress he'd made since he joined the school just a few months ago. As the team gathered around him for a water break, Coach Jackson's deep voice carried across the field. "All right, team, we've got 2 weeks until the tournament. I know you're all working hard, and I'm proud of each and every one of you. Remember, it's not just about winning, it's about playing our best game and supporting each other. Now let's run through that passing drill one more time before we call it a day." The kids groaned good-naturedly, but quickly got into position. Among them was Blake Harrison, a lanky boy with sandy blonde hair who glanced nervously at the sidelines where his father, Mr. Richard Harrison, stood watching with a scowl on his face. As the team wrapped up practice, most parents chatted amiably while waiting for their children. Mr. Harrison, however, stood apart, his arms crossed and his expensive watch glinting in the fading sunlight. "Did you see that?" he muttered to Mrs. Peterson, another parent who had the misfortune of standing near him. Coach Jackson barely gave Blake any attention today. "I don't know why we hired him in the first place." Mrs. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Richard, I think he's doing a fine job. The kids seem to really like him, and Dash. Like him." Mr. Harrison scoffed, cutting her off. "What does that have to do with coaching? I'm telling you, ever since he came on board, Blake's performance has suffered. It's clear he doesn't know how to handle talented players." As the kids started trickling off the field, Blake jogged up to his father, his face flushed from exertion. "Hey, Dad, did you see that assist I made to Jake?" Mr. Harrison's scowl softened slightly as he looked at his son. "I did, sport. Good job out there." But I noticed Coach Jackson didn't say much about it. "Don't worry, I'll have a word with him about giving you more recognition." Blake's smile faltered. "Oh, that's okay, Dad. Coach Jackson talks to me plenty. He says I'm improving a lot." Mr. Harrison's frown deepened. "Well, I'm not so sure about that. Come on, let's get home. Your mother's waiting with dinner." As they walked to their luxury SUV, Mr. Harrison couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "I don't know what the school board was thinking, hiring someone like him." Over the next few weeks, tension began to build around the soccer field. While most parents and kids were excited about the upcoming tournament, Mr. Harrison's discontent grew more obvious with each practice. During one particularly intense scrimmage, Coach Jackson called out, "Blake, remember to pass the ball? You've got teammates open." Mr. Harrison, watching from the sidelines, clenched his fists. "What is he talking about?" he hissed to another father. Blake had a clear shot at the goal. "That coach is holding him back, I'm telling you." The other father, Mr. Rodriguez, raised an eyebrow. "I don't know, Richard. Coach Jackson seems to know what he's doing. The team's really come together since he started." "Come together?" Mr. Harrison scoffed. "Maybe for some of the kids, but not Blake. He's not getting the attention he deserves." As the scrimmage ended and the kids gathered around Coach Jackson for a post-game talk, Mr. Harrison strode across the field, his expensive loafers sinking slightly into the turf. "Coach Jackson," he called out, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "A word, please?" Coach Jackson looked up, his expression neutral. "Mr. Harrison, of course. Just give me a moment to finish up with the team." Mr. Harrison waited impatiently as Coach Jackson spoke to the kids, praising their teamwork and pointing out areas for improvement. When he finally dismissed them, Blake lingered behind, looking worriedly between his father and his coach. "Blake, why don't you go get changed?" Coach Jackson suggested gently. "I'll just have a quick chat with your dad." As Blake reluctantly headed to the locker room, Mr. Harrison wasted no time in voicing his complaints. "Coach, I have to say, I'm concerned about how you're handling the team, especially my son. He's one of the best players out there, and you're not utilizing his talents properly." Coach Jackson took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. "Mr. Harrison, I understand your concern for Blake's development, but I assure you, I'm doing what's best for both Blake and the team as a whole. Soccer is a team sport, and team sport." Mr. Harrison interrupted, his voice rising. "That's just an excuse to hold back the truly talented players. I've been watching, and it's clear you don't know how to handle someone of Blake's caliber." Coach Jackson's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Mr. Harrison, every player on this team is valuable, and my job is to help each of them improve and work together. Blake is a talented player, but he still has areas where he can grow, just like everyone else." Mr. Harrison's face reddened. "I don't believe this. I've been talking to some of the other parents, and they agree with me. Your coaching methods are questionable, to say the least." "I'm sorry you feel that way," Coach Jackson replied, his patience clearly being tested. "But I stand by my methods and my commitment to this team. If you have specific concerns, I'm always happy to discuss them, but I won't prioritize one player over the others." As their conversation grew more heated, neither noticed Blake watching from the edge of the field, his face a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. Over the next few days, whispers began to circulate among the parents. Mr. Harrison, leveraging his influence in the community, had been voicing his complaints to anyone who would listen. Some parents nodded in agreement, while others defended Coach Jackson, creating a palpable divide in the once united group of soccer families. At the next practice, the tension was impossible to ignore. As Coach Jackson led the team through their warm-up exercises, a group of parents huddled near the bleachers, casting furtive glances his way. "I heard he got fired from his last job," one mother whispered, her voice carrying further than she intended. "Maybe there's a reason he ended up at a middle school instead of coaching college teams." Coach Jackson's shoulders tensed slightly, but he kept his focus on the kids, calling out encouragement and corrections as they ran through their drills. Blake, usually enthusiastic during practice, seemed distracted and sullen. When Coach Jackson pulled him aside to offer some advice on his footwork, the boy barely met his eyes. "Everything okay, Blake?" Coach Jackson asked, concern evident in his voice. Blake shrugged, glancing towards where his father stood watching with narrowed eyes. "Yeah, Coach, I'm fine." As practice wound down, Coach Jackson gathered the team for a final pep talk. "Remember, the tournament is just around the corner. I know you're all working hard, and I'm proud of the progress you've made. Keep supporting each other, and we'll show everyone what this team is made of." The kids cheered, their excitement momentarily drowning out the undercurrent of adult tension. As they dispersed, heading towards their waiting parents, Coach Jackson couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation. "Don't know why they hired him in the first place. Heard he favors certain players. Maybe we should talk to the principal." Coach Jackson took a deep breath, steeling himself against the whispers. He'd faced prejudice before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him. It was about the kids he'd grown to care for, the team he was building. As he packed up the equipment, Mr. Harrison approached, his face set in a grim expression. "Coach Jackson, I hope you've considered what we discussed. Things can't continue like this." Coach Jackson straightened up, meeting Mr. Harrison's gaze. "Mr. Harrison, I understand you have concerns, but I assure you, I'm doing what's best for the entire team. If you'd like to schedule a meeting with me and the school administration to discuss this further, I'm more than willing." Mr. Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Oh, don't worry. I intend to take this up with the administration. We'll see how long you last once they hear what's really going on here." As Mr. Harrison stormed off, Blake trailing behind him with slumped shoulders, Coach Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was brewing, one that threatened not just his job, but the unity of the team he'd worked so hard to build. That night, as Coach Jackson sat at his kitchen table, head in his hands, his wife Sarah gently placed a cup of tea in front of him. "Rough day?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Marcus looked up, his eyes tired but determined. "Nothing I can't handle. It's just, I've dealt with prejudice before, but seeing it affect these kids? That's what really gets to me." Sarah reached out, squeezing his hand. "You're doing amazing work with those kids, Marcus. Don't let a few narrow-minded parents make you doubt yourself." Marcus nodded, drawing strength from her support. "You're right. I just hope the school stands behind me when things inevitably come to a head." As they sat in companionable silence, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what the coming days would bring. Little did he know, the situation was about to escalate in ways he couldn't have imagined. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Richard Harrison sat down at his mahogany desk, a crisp sheet of paper before him. His face was set in grim determination as he began to craft a formal complaint against Coach Marcus Jackson. The scratch of his expensive fountain pen filled the quiet study, punctuated only by the occasional frustrated sigh. "To whom it may concern," he began, his handwriting sharp and angular, "I am writing to express my deep concerns regarding the recent appointment of Marcus Jackson as the middle school soccer coach." As he wrote, Mr. Harrison's complaints grew more pointed, each sentence dripping with thinly veiled prejudice. He accused Coach Jackson of favoritism, incompetence, and a lack of proper qualifications. Though he never explicitly mentioned race, the implications were clear in every carefully chosen word. Furthermore, he continued, his pen practically stabbing the paper, "I question the wisdom of hiring someone with such limited experience to shape the minds and abilities of our children. Surely, there were more suitable candidates available." After an hour of writing and rewriting, Mr. Harrison sat back, a satisfied smirk on his face. He read through the complaint one last time, making sure it sounded professional and unbiased on the surface, while still conveying his true feelings about Coach Jackson. Later that morning, Mr. Harrison strode into Oak Ridge Middle School, his complaint letter tucked securely in his briefcase. He bypassed the front office, heading straight for Principal Emily Collins' office. The secretary tried to stop him, explaining that the principal was in a meeting, but Mr. Harrison brushed past her with barely a glance. "Mr. Harrison," Principal Collins exclaimed as he burst into her office. "I'm in the middle of dash." "This can't wait, Emily," Mr. Harrison interrupted, pulling out his letter. "I've got a formal complaint about that new coach, and I demand it be addressed immediately." Principal Collins sighed, gesturing for her meeting attendee to give them a moment. She took the letter from Mr. Harrison, her brow furrowing as she skimmed its contents. "Richard," she said carefully, "these are some serious accusations. Are you sure, Dash?" "Absolutely," Mr. Harrison cut in. "And I'm not the only one who feels this way. You'll be hearing from other parents soon, I can assure you." As Mr. Harrison left the office, his threat hanging in the air, Principal Collins couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was brewing, one that could tear the school community apart. True to his word, Mr. Harrison wasted no time in rallying other parents to his cause. That very afternoon, he cornered Mrs. Peterson in the school parking lot as she waited to pick up her daughter. "Sandra," he called out, his voice dripping with false concern, "I'm so glad I caught you. Have you noticed anything off about Coach Jackson's behavior lately?" Mrs. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I'm not sure what you mean, Richard." Mr. Harrison leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I've heard some disturbing things. Favoritism, unfair treatment. I've even filed a formal complaint with the school. I think it's time we parents took a stand, don't you?" Mrs. Peterson hesitated, torn between her own observations of Coach Jackson's positive impact and the influence of Mr. Harrison's words. I suppose I could take a look at your complaint," she said finally, her resolve weakening under Mr. Harrison's intense gaze. Over the next few days, Mr. Harrison's campaign against Coach Jackson gained momentum. He cornered parents at school events, called them at home, and even hosted a small gathering at his lavish house under the guise of discussing concerns about the soccer program. At this gathering, Mr. Harrison stood before a group of about a dozen parents, his voice passionate as he laid out his case against Coach Jackson. "Friends," he began, pacing in front of the fireplace in his opulent living room, "we all want what's best for our children, don't we? But how can we expect them to thrive under the guidance of someone who clearly doesn't understand the needs of our community? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Mr. Harrison pressed on, his words carefully chosen to stoke the flames of discontent without explicitly mentioning race. "I've prepared a petition," he announced, producing a stack of papers, calling for the school to review Coach Jackson's qualifications and methods. "If we stand together, they'll have to listen to our concerns." As the petition made its way around the room, some parents signed eagerly, nodding along with Mr. Harrison's rhetoric. Others, like Mr. Rodriguez, hesitated, pen hovering above the paper. "I don't know, Richard," Mr. Rodriguez said, his brow furrowed. "Coach Jackson seems to be doing a good job. My son Carlos has really improved under his guidance." Mr. Harrison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. But don't you think Carlos could be doing even better with a more experienced coach? Someone who truly understands the culture of our school?" The pressure in the room was palpable. Mr. Rodriguez glanced around, noting the expectant looks from the other parents. With a resigned sigh, he scrawled his signature on the petition, silently hoping he wasn't making a terrible mistake. As the gathering dispersed, Mr. Harrison couldn't hide his satisfaction. He had successfully sown the seeds of doubt, and now he just had to wait for them to grow. Meanwhile, on the soccer field, the tension was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Coach Jackson noticed the whispers and pointed looks from parents on the sidelines, but he tried to stay focused on the kids and their training. During one practice, he overheard a heated conversation between two mothers as he walked past to retrieve a stray ball. "Did you sign Richard's petition?" one asked in a hushed tone. "Not yet," the other replied, glancing nervously at Coach Jackson. "I'm not sure I agree with everything he's saying, but well, you know how Richard can be when he sets his mind to something." Coach Jackson's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to keep moving, pretending he hadn't heard. He'd faced prejudice before, but this felt different, more insidious, more threatening to the team he was trying to build. As he gathered the team for their end-of-practice huddle, he couldn't help but notice the way some of the kids, especially Blake Harrison, avoided meeting his eyes. The once unified team seemed to be fracturing along the same lines as their parents. "All right, team," Coach Jackson said, trying to inject enthusiasm into his voice. "Great practice today. Remember, we're stronger together. Whatever challenges we face them as a team. Now hands in Oak Ridge on 3. The team's response was lackluster, their usual energy dampened by the tension in the air. As the kids dispersed to their waiting parents, Coach Jackson caught sight of Mr. Harrison standing at the edge of the field, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That evening, as Coach Jackson sat at his kitchen table reviewing practice notes, his phone buzzed with a text from Principal Collins. "Need to see you first thing tomorrow morning." "Important." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. He had a sinking feeling he knew what this was about. Sarah, noticing his distress, came over and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, concern etching her features. Marcus showed her the text. "I think the storm's about to break," he said quietly. "Harrison's been rallying the parents against me, and now it looks like the principal wants to talk." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "This is ridiculous. You've done nothing but help those kids. Surely the school can see through Harrison's prejudice?" "I hope so," Marcus replied, his voice tired but determined. "But I've been in this situation before. Sometimes it's easier for people to give in to the loudest voice than to stand up for what's right." As they sat in silence, the weight of uncertainty hanging over them, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what the morning would bring. Would the school stand behind him, or would Harrison's influence prove too strong to resist? The next morning, Coach Jackson arrived at school early, his stomach twisted in knots. As he approached Principal Collins' office, he could hear raised voices from inside. He recognized Mr. Harrison's distinctive tone, dripping with self-righteousness. "This is unacceptable. Emily," Mr. Harrison was saying as Coach Jackson knocked on the door. "We demand action." Principal Collins' voice was strained but firm. "Mr. Harrison, I understand your concerns, but we need to approach this rationally. She broke off as Coach Jackson entered the room. Mr. Harrison spun around, his face flushing with barely concealed anger. "Ah, how convenient," Mr. Harrison sneered. "We were just discussing you, Coach." Principal Collins shot Mr. Harrison a warning look before turning to Coach Jackson. "Marcus, thank you for coming in early. As you can probably guess, we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your coaching methods." Coach Jackson nodded, his face a mask of calm despite the turmoil he felt inside. "Of course, Principal Collins. I'm happy to address any concerns." Mr. Harrison scoffed. "Concerns? That's putting it mildly. I have here," he said, brandishing a thick folder, "a petition signed by over 30 parents demanding a review of Coach Jackson's qualifications and methods. The evidence of his incompetence is overwhelming." Principal Collins held up a hand, silencing Mr. Harrison's tirade. "Marcus, I want to assure you that we take these allegations seriously, but we also value your contributions to our school. Can you tell us your side of the story?" Coach Jackson took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He knew he had to choose his words carefully. One misstep could cost him everything he'd worked for. "Principal Collins, Mr. Harrison," he began, his voice steady, "I understand that change can be difficult and that my methods might be different from what some parents are used to. But everything I do is aimed at helping these kids grow, not just as athletes, but as individuals." Mr. Harrison opened his mouth to interject, but Principal Collins silenced him with a look. Coach Jackson continued, "I believe in treating every child fairly, pushing them to reach their full potential. That sometimes means being tough, but it always comes from a place of care and respect." "Respect?" Mr. Harrison spat. "Is that what you call benching talented players and favoring others?" The implication in Mr. Harrison's tone was clear, and Coach Jackson felt his anger rising. But he forced himself to remain calm, knowing that losing his temper would only prove Mr. Harrison right in the eyes of those who already doubted him. "Mr. Harrison," Coach Jackson said evenly, "I don't favor any player over another. I make decisions based on what's best for the team as a whole. Sometimes that means giving more playing time to kids who need to develop their skills, or benching a strong player to teach them the importance of teamwork." Principal Collins nodded thoughtfully. "That seems like a reasonable approach, Coach Jackson." "Mr. Harrison, while I understand your concerns, I'm not seeing evidence of the incompetence you've alleged." Mr. Harrison's face reddened. "Evidence? What about the petition? What about the dozens of parents who agree with me that he's unfit to coach our children?" "Mr. Harrison," Principal Collins said firmly, "a difference in coaching philosophy does not equate to incompetence. From what I've seen and heard from other staff members, Coach Jackson has had a positive impact on many of our students." Mr. Harrison sputtered, clearly not expecting this pushback. But what about his qualifications? Surely someone with his background isn't the best choice for our school." The room fell silent, the weight of Mr. Harrison's thinly veiled prejudice hanging in the air. Coach Jackson felt a mixture of anger and sadness wash over him. He'd hoped that by proving himself through his work, he could overcome the biases he'd faced his whole life. But here he was once again having to defend his very right to be in the room. Principal Collins broke the tense silence, her voice cold. "Mr. Harrison, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear the implication in that statement. Coach Jackson's qualifications were thoroughly vetted before he was hired, and his performance since joining our staff has been exemplary." She turned to Coach Jackson, her expression softening. "Marcus, I want you to know that you have the full support of the administration. We believe in your methods and the positive impact you're having on our students." Relief washed over Coach Jackson, but he knew this wasn't the end of the battle. Mr. Harrison wouldn't give up easily, and the discord he'd sown among the parents would take time to heal. As if reading his thoughts, Principal Collins continued, "However, we can't ignore the concerns raised by some parents. I think it would be beneficial to hold a parent-teacher meeting to address these issues openly and honestly." Coach Jackson nodded. "I think that's a great idea, Principal Collins. I'm more than willing to discuss my methods and answer any questions parents might have." Mr. Harrison, realizing he was losing ground, tried one last tactic. "And what about the children? Shouldn't their opinions be considered? I know for a fact that many of them, including my son Blake, are unhappy with Coach Jackson's methods." Principal Collins considered this for a moment. You raise a fair point, Mr. Harrison. Perhaps we should include some of the team members in this meeting as well. It would give us a more rounded perspective on the situation. As the details of the meeting were hammered out, Coach Jackson couldn't shake a feeling of unease. He knew that this meeting could make or break his career at Oak Ridge Middle School. More importantly, it could determine whether he'd be able to continue helping the kids he'd grown to care for deeply. Leaving the principal's office, Coach Jackson's mind raced with thoughts of the upcoming meeting. He knew he had to be prepared for anything: accusations, loaded questions, perhaps even outright hostility from some parents. As he walked down the hallway, lost in thought, he nearly collided with Blake Harrison, who was heading to class. "Oh, sorry, Coach," Blake mumbled, barely meeting Coach Jackson's eyes. Coach Jackson noticed the boy's slumped shoulders and downcast expression. "Blake, is everything okay?" he asked gently. Blake hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. It's nothing, Coach. I gotta get to class." As Blake hurried away, Coach Jackson couldn't help but wonder what was going through the boy's mind. Was he truly unhappy with the coaching, as Mr. Harrison claimed? Or was there something else going on? Over the next few days, as news of the upcoming parent-teacher meeting spread, the atmosphere around the school grew even more tense. Coach Jackson could feel the eyes of parents and students on him wherever he went, some supportive, others suspicious or openly hostile. During practices, he tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, focusing on preparing the team for their upcoming tournament. But he couldn't ignore the way some kids, particularly those whose parents had signed Mr. Harrison's petition, seemed to be pulling away from him. One afternoon, as the team was running drills, Coach Jackson overheard a conversation between two players that made his heart sink. "My dad says Coach Jackson doesn't know what he's doing," one boy whispered to his teammate. "He says we should have a coach who understands our community better." The other boy nodded. "Yeah, my mom signed some petition about it. She says Coach Jackson plays favorites and doesn't give everyone a fair chance." Coach Jackson pretended not to hear, but inside, he was struggling with a mix of anger and sadness. He'd poured his heart and soul into coaching these kids, trying to help them grow not just as athletes, but as people. To hear his efforts dismissed so casually, based on nothing but prejudice and misunderstanding, was deeply disheartening. As the day of the parent-teacher meeting approached, Coach Jackson spent his evenings preparing, gathering evidence of his team's progress, and thinking through how to address the concerns that had been raised. Sarah was a constant source of support, helping him rehearse his responses and reminding him of the positive impact he'd had on so many kids. "You've got this, Marcus," she said the night before the meeting, squeezing his hand. "Just speak from your heart. The truth will shine through." Coach Jackson nodded, drawing strength from her confidence. "I hope you're right," he said softly, "because this isn't just about me. It's about those kids and the kind of example we're setting for them." As he lay in bed that night, sleep eluding him, Coach Jackson couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. Would he be able to bridge the divide that had formed in the community? Or would Mr. Harrison's influence prove too strong to overcome? One thing was certain: the upcoming meeting would be a turning point, not just for Coach Jackson's career, but for the entire Oak Ridge Middle School community. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone to examine their beliefs and biases and potentially change the course of many lives. As the sun peeked through the curtains of the Jackson family home, Coach Marcus Jackson was already up, sipping his morning coffee and reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this crucial moment in his life. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of Sarah's famous blueberry pancakes wafting from the kitchen. Marcus smiled as he watched his two children, 10-year-old Zoe and 8-year-old Jamal, playfully argue over the last pancake. This scene of domestic bliss was a far cry from his own childhood in the rough neighborhoods of East St. Louis. Growing up, Marcus had faced more challenges than most kids his age could imagine. His mother, a hard-working single parent, did her best to provide for Marcus and his 3 siblings, but life in their low-income neighborhood was far from easy. The streets were tough, and temptation lurked around every corner. "Marcus," his mother's voice echoed in his memory, "you're meant for more than this. Don't let these streets define you." Those words had become his mantra, pushing him to excel both in academics and athletics. Soccer became his escape, a way to channel his energy and stay out of trouble. His natural talent, combined with an unshakable work ethic, caught the eye of his high school coach, Mr. Thompson. "You've got something special, Jackson," Mr. Thompson had told him after a particularly grueling practice. "But talent alone won't cut it. You need discipline, dedication, and a whole lot of heart." Those words stuck with Marcus, shaping his approach to both soccer and life. With Mr. Thompson's guidance and his mother's unwavering support, Marcus earned a soccer scholarship to a prestigious university, becoming the first in his family to attend college. College life was a culture shock for Marcus. Suddenly, he was surrounded by peers who had never known the struggles of his childhood. But rather than letting this intimidate him, Marcus used it as motivation to work even harder. "You belong here," he would tell himself in moments of doubt. "You've earned your place." His determination paid off. Marcus not only excelled on the soccer field, leading his team to 2 national championships, but he also shone in the classroom, majoring in education with a minor in psychology. After graduation, Marcus's soccer skills earned him a spot on a professional team. For a few years, he lived the dream of playing the sport he loved at the highest level. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind kept reminding him of the kids back in his old neighborhood. Kids who needed the kind of guidance and support he had been lucky enough to receive. So, when an injury cut his professional career short, Marcus saw it not as an end, but as an opportunity to give back. He returned to his alma mater as an assistant coach, quickly gaining a reputation for his ability to connect with young athletes and bring out their best, both on and off the field. "You've got a gift, Marcus," the head coach had told him after a particularly successful season. "These kids don't just play better under your guidance. They become better people." It was this realization that led Marcus to make a decision that surprised many of his colleagues. Despite offers from several top universities, he chose to accept a position as the middle school soccer coach at Oak Ridge Middle School. "Are you sure about this, honey?" Sarah had asked when he told her about his decision. "You could be coaching at any college in the country." Marcus had smiled, taking her hands in his. "I'm sure," he said. "This is where I can make the biggest difference. These kids, they're at a critical age. The right guidance now could change the entire course of their lives." Now, as he sat at his kitchen table, preparing for the parent-teacher meeting that could determine his future at Oak Ridge, Marcus reflected on the impact he'd had on his team over the past few months. He thought of Tina, the shy girl who had barely spoken a word during the first few practices. Through patient encouragement and positive reinforcement, Marcus had watched her blossom into one of the team's most vocal leaders. "Coach Jackson," Tina had said after a recent practice, her eyes shining, "I never thought I could be good at anything. But you believed in me, and now I believe in myself." Then there was Carlos, whose quick temper had initially caused problems on and off the field. Marcus had recognized in Carlos the same anger and frustration he had felt as a teenager. Through one-on-one talks and team-building exercises, he had helped Carlos channel his emotions into positive energy. "You know, Coach," Carlos had confided during a water break, "my dad says I'm like a different kid since I joined the team. I don't get into fights at school anymore. I guess I found something better to do with my energy." And of course, there was Blake Harrison. Despite his father's hostility, Marcus had seen real potential in Blake, not just as an athlete, but as a leader. He had pushed Blake hard, challenging him to think beyond his own abilities and consider the needs of the team. "Blake," Marcus had said after a particularly tough practice, "being the best player doesn't always mean scoring the most goals. Sometimes it means making your teammates better." At first, Blake had resisted, clearly influenced by his father's win-at-all-cost mentality. But gradually, Marcus had seen a change in the boy. Blake started passing more, encouraging his teammates, even staying after practice to help the less skilled players improve their technique. These transformations weren't just about soccer. Marcus knew that the lessons of teamwork, discipline, and respect that he instilled in his players would serve them well throughout their lives. As he finished his coffee, Marcus's mind wandered to the upcoming meeting. He knew that Mr. Harrison and his supporters would try to paint him as unqualified, maybe even harmful to the children. The thought made his stomach churn, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself of the progress his team had made. "You've got this, honey," Sarah said, coming up behind him and placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Those kids adore you, and any parent who takes the time to really look will see the positive change you've brought to their lives." Marcus nodded, drawing strength from his wife's unwavering support. "I just hope they give me a chance to show them what we've really been doing," he said softly. As he got up to get ready for the day, Marcus's resolve strengthened. He wasn't just fighting for his job, he was fighting for his players, for the chance to continue making a difference in their lives. The drive to Oak Ridge Middle School that morning felt longer than usual. As Marcus pulled into the parking lot, he could see groups of parents already gathering, some with concerned looks, others with expressions of support. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped out of his car, his game face on. As he walked towards the school entrance, he was surprised to hear a small voice call out, "Coach Jackson." Turning, he saw Zach, one of his players, running towards him. Zach's mother, Mrs. Thompson, followed close behind, an apologetic look on her face. "I'm sorry, Coach Jackson," Mrs. Thompson said as they approached. Zach insisted on coming early when he heard about the meeting. "He wanted to talk to you." Marcus knelt down to Zach's level, a warm smile on his face. "What's up, buddy?" Zach, usually a bundle of energy, looked uncharacteristically serious. "Coach, is it true that some parents want you to leave?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Marcus's heart clenched at the worry in the boy's eyes. "Some parents are concerned, Zach," he said gently. "That's why we're having this meeting, to talk about those concerns." Zach's face scrunched up in determination. "Well, I want to tell them how great you are. Before you came, I was always picked last for teams. I thought I was no good at sports, but you showed me that I just needed to believe in myself and practice hard." Mrs. Thompson placed a hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes misty. "It's true, Coach Jackson," she said softly. "Zach's confidence has skyrocketed since you started coaching. It's not just about soccer. He's doing better in all his classes now." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. This was why he did what he did, not for the wins or the accolades, but for moments like these when he could see the real impact he was having on young lives. "Thank you, Zach," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot to me. And you know what? No matter what happens in that meeting, I'm proud of you and all your teammates. You've all worked so hard and come so far." As Zach and his mother headed into the school, Marcus stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had touched lives, made a difference. Whatever happened in that meeting, no one could take that away from him. Inside the school, the atmosphere was tense. As Marcus made his way to the gymnasium where the meeting would be held, he could feel eyes on him, some supportive, others skeptical or outright hostile. Just before he reached the gym doors, he felt a hand on his arm. Turning, he saw Principal Collins, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "Marcus," she said in a low voice, "I want you to know that the school board and I stand behind you. We've seen the positive changes you've brought to this school. Just keep your cool in there, okay? No matter what gets said." Marcus nodded, grateful for the support. "Thank you, Principal Collins. I'll do my best." As they entered the gym together, Marcus was taken aback by the number of people present. It seemed like half the school had turned out for this meeting. Parents, teachers, and even some students filled the bleachers, their voices a low murmur of anticipation. At the front of the room, a long table had been set up. Marcus took his seat at one end, with Principal Collins beside him. At the other end sat Mr. Harrison, his face set in a grim expression of determination. As the meeting was called to order, Marcus scanned the crowd. He saw some friendly faces, parents who had expressed support for his methods, kids from the soccer team who were looking at him with a mixture of worry and admiration. But he also saw plenty of skeptical looks, parents who had been swayed by Mr. Harrison's campaign against him. Principal Collins stood to address the gathering. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "We're here today to discuss concerns that have been raised about Coach Jackson's methods and qualifications. I want to assure everyone that we take these concerns seriously, but we also want to ensure that all perspectives are heard. Coach Jackson has had a significant impact on many of our students, and it's important that we consider the full picture." As she spoke, Marcus could see Mr. Harrison shifting impatiently in his seat. When Principal Collins finished her introduction, Mr. Harrison wasted no time in taking the floor. "With all due respect, Principal Collins," he began, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt, I think you're downplaying the seriousness of this situation. We have over 30 parents who have signed a petition expressing grave concerns about Coach Jackson's methods." He paused for effect, looking around the room. "This isn't just about soccer. It's about the values we want to instill in our children. Coach Jackson's approach is unorthodox, to say the least. He benches talented players, he pushes kids beyond their limits, and he seems to have little regard for the traditions and values of our community." As Mr. Harrison spoke, Marcus could feel his blood beginning to boil. Every fiber of his being wanted to jump up and defend himself, to point out the hypocrisy and thinly veiled prejudice in Mr. Harrison's words. But he remembered Principal Collins' advice and forced himself to remain calm. When Mr. Harrison finally finished his tirade, Principal Collins turned to Marcus. "Coach Jackson, would you like to respond to these allegations?" Marcus stood slowly, taking a deep breath to center himself. As he looked out over the sea of faces, he was reminded of all the pep talks he'd given his team before big games. This, he realized, was his most important game yet. "Thank you, Principal Collins," he began, his voice steady and clear. "And thank you all for coming today. I know many of you have concerns, and I want to address them honestly and openly." He paused, making eye contact with various parents and students in the audience. "When I came to Oak Ridge, I didn't just see a soccer team. I saw a group of young people with incredible potential, not just as athletes, but as leaders, as teammates, as members of this community." Marcus could see some of the tension in the room easing as he spoke. Even some of the more skeptical parents seemed to be listening intently. "My approach isn't about winning at all costs," he continued. "It's about helping these kids become the best versions of themselves. Sometimes that means pushing them out of their comfort zones. Sometimes it means teaching them that being a good teammate is just as important as being a good player." He turned to look directly at Mr. Harrison. "I understand that change can be uncomfortable, but I ask you to look beyond the win-loss record, beyond your preconceptions, and see what's really happening on that field." As if on cue, a hand shot up from the audience. It was Carlos, the boy whose temper had been such a challenge at the beginning of the season. "Can I say something?" Carlos asked, his voice wavering slightly. Principal Collins nodded, and Carlos stood, facing the crowd of parents. "Before Coach Jackson came, I was always in trouble," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I was angry all the time, getting into fights. I was even thinking about dropping out of school." He paused, swallowing hard. "But Coach Jackson, he didn't give up on me. He taught me how to control my anger, how to be part of a team. Now, I'm not just doing better in soccer. I'm doing better in all my classes. I'm not getting into fights anymore. Coach Jackson, he changed my life." As Carlos sat down, a murmur ran through the crowd. Marcus could see looks of surprise and thoughtfulness on many faces. Another hand went up. This time it was Tina, the once shy girl who had become a team leader. "Coach Jackson taught me that I have a voice," she said, her words clear and confident. "He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Now I'm not just a better soccer player. I'm more confident in everything I do." One by one, more students stood to speak. Each had a story of how Coach Jackson had impacted their lives, not just on the soccer field, but in ways that extended far beyond sports. As the testimonials continued, Marcus could see the mood in the room shifting. Many of the parents who had looked skeptical at the beginning of the meeting now wore expressions of surprise and appreciation. Even some of those who had signed Mr. Harrison's petition were nodding along with the students' stories. Mr. Harrison, for his part, looked increasingly uncomfortable. His earlier confidence had given way to a look of growing frustration as he realized his carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. When the last student had spoken, Principal Collins stood again. "Thank you all for your honesty and courage," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I think it's clear that Coach Jackson has had a profound impact on many of our students." She turned to face the parents. "I understand that change can be difficult and that Coach Jackson's methods may be different from what some of you are used to. But I ask you to consider the evidence we've heard today. Not just the words, but the confidence and poise these students have shown in speaking up." Marcus felt a wave of gratitude wash over him as he listened to Principal Collins. He hadn't asked any of the students to speak on his behalf. Their words had come straight from their hearts. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus could sense a shift in the room. The hostility that had been palpable at the beginning had largely dissipated, replaced by a thoughtful, almost respectful silence. Even Mr. Harrison seemed subdued, though Marcus could still see the frustration simmering behind his eyes. As people began to file out of the gym, many stopped to shake Marcus's hand or offer words of support. "I had no idea," one mother said, her eyes misty. "My son never tells me anything about school, but he's always talking about soccer practice now. Thank you for what you're doing." Another parent, whom Marcus recognized as one of the petition signers, approached him with an apologetic look. "Coach Jackson, I think I may have judged you too quickly." After hearing those kids speak, "Well, I'd like to take some time to see your coaching for myself, if that's all right." Marcus nodded, feeling a mix of relief and cautious optimism. "I'd be happy to have you at our practices," he said warmly. "My door is always open for parents who want to get involved." As the gym emptied, Marcus found himself face to face with Mr. Harrison. For a moment, the two men stared at each other in silence. Finally, Mr. Harrison spoke, his voice low and tight. "This isn't over, Jackson. You may have won them over for now, but I'll be watching. One slip-up, one mistake, and I'll make sure everyone knows about it." Marcus met Mr. Harrison's gaze steadily. "Mr. Harrison, I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to coach these kids, to help them grow and learn. I hope that one day you'll be able to see that." With that, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving Mr. Harrison standing alone in the empty gym. As he stepped out into the sunlight, Marcus took a deep breath, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The battle wasn't over, he knew that. But for now, at least, he had been given the chance to continue his work, to keep making a difference in these kids' lives. As he walked towards his car, Marcus spotted Blake Harrison lingering near the school entrance. The boy looked conflicted, glancing back and forth between Marcus and the gym doors where his father would soon emerge. "Everything okay, Blake?" Marcus called out, approaching the boy slowly. Blake shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable. I wanted to say something in there, Coach," he mumbled, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. "But I was afraid of what my dad would think." Marcus's heart went out to the boy. He knelt down to Blake's level, his voice gentle. "It's okay, Blake. I understand. These situations can be tough." Blake finally looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You've taught me so much, Coach. Not just about soccer, but about being a good teammate, about thinking of others. I don't want you to leave." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm not going anywhere, Blake," he said softly. "As long as the school will have me, I'll be here. And no matter what happens with your dad, I want you to know that I'm proud of the progress you've made." Blake nodded, a small smile breaking through his worried expression. "Thanks, Coach," he said before quickly turning and hurrying away as the gym doors opened and parents began to file out. As Marcus watched Blake go, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why he had chosen to coach at the middle school level. These kids were at a crucial point in their lives, forming the values and beliefs that would shape their futures. If he could make a positive impact now, it could change the entire trajectory of their lives. Driving home that evening, Marcus reflected on the meeting and its aftermath. He knew that not everyone had been convinced. Mr. Harrison, in particular, would likely continue to be a thorn in his side. But the overwhelming support from the students and the change of heart from some of the parents gave him hope. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus saw Sarah waiting for him on the porch, her face anxious. He got out of the car, a tired but triumphant smile on his face. "How did it go?" Sarah asked as soon as he was within earshot. Marcus pulled her into a hug. "It was tough," he admitted. "But the kids—" "Sarah, you should have seen them. They stood up and told their stories. They showed everyone what we've really been doing out there on that field." Sarah's eyes welled up with happy tears. "Oh, Marcus, I'm so proud of you." As they went inside, where Zoe and Jamal were eagerly waiting to hear about the meeting, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude. He was grateful for his family, for the support of Principal Collins and many of the parents, but most of all for the trust and courage of his players. Later that night, as he lay in bed unable to sleep, Marcus's mind wandered to the challenges that still lay ahead. He knew that winning over the remaining skeptical parents would take time and consistent effort. He would need to continue proving himself day in and day out. The weeks following the parent-teacher meeting were a whirlwind of activity for Coach Marcus Jackson. The tension that had threatened to tear apart the Oak Ridge Middle School community had eased, but Marcus knew that the real work was just beginning. He was determined to prove to everyone, supporters and skeptics alike, that their faith in him was not misplaced. As Marcus pulled into the school parking lot early one morning, he couldn't help but smile at the sight of several kids already waiting by the soccer field, eager to start there before school practice. Among them was Blake Harrison, his face a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Morning, team," Marcus called out as he approached, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. "Ready to put in some work?" A chorus of enthusiastic "Yes, Coach," responses greeted him, and Marcus felt a surge of pride. These kids, with their unwavering dedication and infectious energy, were the reason he pushed himself every day to be the best coach and mentor he could be. As they began their warm-up drills, Marcus noticed Blake glancing nervously towards the parking lot. Following the boy's gaze, he saw Mr. Harrison's luxury SUV pull in. The man himself stepped out, his face set in a stern expression as he watched the practice from afar. Marcus approached Blake, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Everything okay, Blake?" Blake nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on his father. "Yeah, Coach. It's just my dad said he'd be coming to more practices. To keep an eye on things," he said. Marcus felt a twinge of frustration, but he pushed it aside. "Well, then we'll just have to show him what we're all about, won't we?" he said with a wink. "Come on, let's show him that passing drill we've been working on." As the practice progressed, Marcus could feel Mr. Harrison's eyes boring into him. But instead of letting it rattle him, he channeled that energy into his coaching. He moved from player to player, offering encouragement, correcting techniques, and pushing each kid to give their best effort. "Great job, Tina," he called out as the once shy girl executed a perfect cross. "Carlos, excellent defensive work. Blake, remember what we talked about? Keep your head up when you're dribbling." By the end of the practice, even Mr. Harrison seemed impressed despite himself. As the kids gathered their things and headed off to class, Marcus saw Mr. Harrison approach Blake. He was too far away to hear their conversation, but he saw Blake's face light up at something his father said. As Mr. Harrison walked past Marcus on his way back to his car, he gave a curt nod. It wasn't much, but it was more acknowledgement than he'd offered since the parent-teacher meeting. Marcus returned the nod, allowing himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were making progress. Over the next few weeks, Marcus threw himself into his coaching with renewed vigor. He organized extra practice sessions, worked one-on-one with kids who needed additional support, and even started a mentoring program where older players helped guide the younger ones. One afternoon, as Marcus was setting up cones for a drill, he was surprised to see Mrs. Peterson approach. She had been one of the parents who had initially signed Mr. Harrison's petition, but had seemed thoughtful after the parent-teacher meeting. "Coach Jackson," she called out, a hesitant smile on her face. "Do you have a moment?" Marcus straightened up, wiping his hands on his shorts. "Of course, Mrs. Peterson. What can I do for you?" Mrs. Peterson took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I signed that petition without really understanding what was going on. But I've been watching these practices, talking to my son. I see now how much good you're doing here." Marcus felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson," he said, his voice thick. "That means a lot to me." Mrs. Peterson nodded, her smile growing more confident. "I was wondering, is there anything I can do to help? With the team, I mean? I used to play soccer in college, and I'd love to get involved if you could use an extra pair of hands." Marcus beamed, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Absolutely. We could always use more support. How would you feel about helping run some drills for our defense?" As Mrs. Peterson eagerly agreed, and they began to discuss ideas, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was what he had hoped for, not just acceptance, but true engagement from the parents and the community. As the weeks passed, more parents began to come forward, offering their support and getting involved with the team. Mr. Rodriguez volunteered to help with transportation for away games. Mrs. Thompson, Zach's mother, organized a fundraiser to buy new equipment for the team. Even some of the teachers started showing up to practices and games, cheering on their students from the sidelines. The change in the team was remarkable. With the increased support and resources, the kids were thriving. Their skills on the field were improving rapidly, but more importantly, Marcus saw them growing as individuals. They were more confident, more supportive of each other, more willing to take on challenges both on and off the field. One person, however, remained a stubborn holdout. Mr. Harrison, true to his word, continued to attend practices and games, his critical eye never wavering. While he had ceased his open hostility, his silence and stoic expression were a constant reminder that not everyone was fully on board with Marcus's methods. As the end of the season approached, tension began to build. The team had performed better than anyone had expected, making it to the finals of the district tournament. It was the furthest an Oak Ridge Middle School team had ever gone, and excitement was running high. The night before the big game, Marcus stayed late at the school, reviewing game footage and finalizing his strategy. As he was locking up the equipment shed, he was startled to see Mr. Harrison approaching through the darkness. "Mr. Harrison," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "It's a bit late for a visit, isn't it?" Mr. Harrison stood silent for a moment, his face unreadable in the dim light of the parking lot lamps. Finally, he spoke, his voice gruff. "I've been watching you, Jackson, watching how you work with these kids." Marcus tensed, preparing himself for another confrontation. But Mr. Harrison's next words took him completely by surprise. "I don't agree with all your methods," Mr. Harrison continued, "but I can't deny the results. These kids, they're different. Better. Even Blake." He trailed off, emotion creeping into his voice for the first time since Marcus had known him. Marcus waited, hardly daring to breathe. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and continued. "Blake told me something the other day. He said that because of you, he's learned that being a leader isn't about being the best player. It's about making everyone around you better." Mr. Harrison met Marcus's eyes, a hint of grudging respect in his gaze. "That's not something I ever taught him, but it's a lesson I wish I'd learned a long time ago." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. "Mr. Harrison, But Mr. Harrison held up a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not here to be friends, Jackson, but I wanted you to know, tomorrow, at that game, you got my support, for whatever that's worth." Before Marcus could respond, Mr. Harrison turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the dark, his mind reeling from the unexpected encounter. The next day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the championship game. As Marcus arrived at the school, he was amazed to see the parking lot already filling up. It seemed like the entire town had turned out to support the team. In the locker room, Marcus could feel the nervous energy radiating from his players. They were excited, but also scared, the weight of expectations heavy on their young shoulders. "All right, team, gather round," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the chatter. As the kids formed a circle around him, he looked at each of their faces, seeing the mix of hope and fear in their eyes. "I know you're feeling the pressure today," he began, his voice calm and steady. "But I want you to remember something. This game? It's important, but it's not the most important thing." He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. "The most important thing is who you've become over this season. The way you've learned to work together, to support each other, to push yourselves beyond what you thought was possible. That's what really matters." Marcus saw nods of understanding, some of the tension easing from the kids' faces. "So, when you go out there today, I don't want you thinking about the score. I want you thinking about your teammates, about giving your best effort, about playing with heart and integrity. If you do that, then no matter what the scoreboard says at the end of the game, you'll be champions in my book." "Got it." A chorus of "Yes, coach," filled the locker room, the energy shifting from nervous to determined. As the team filed out towards the field, Marcus felt a swell of pride. Win or lose, these kids had already accomplished so much. The game was intense from the opening whistle. The opposing team was skilled and well-coached, matching Oak Ridge play for play. As the minutes ticked by, neither team was able to gain a significant advantage. From his position on the sideline, Marcus watched his team with a mixture of pride and anxiety. They were playing well, applying all the skills and strategies they'd worked so hard on throughout the season. But the other team was just as determined. And as the second half began with the score still tied at 0-0, Marcus could see his players starting to tire. "Come on, team," he called out encouragingly. "Remember what we talked about. Support each other. Keep your heads up." As if in response to his words, he saw Blake make a brilliant interception, quickly passing the ball to Tina. Tina, showing a confidence that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the season, dribbled past two defenders before sending a perfect cross to Carlos. Carlos, who once would have tried to take on the entire opposing team himself, instead made a quick pass to Zach, who had a clear shot at the goal. The ball soared through the air, seeming to move in slow motion as it arced towards the net. The entire crowd held its breath, and then erupted in cheers as the ball hit the back of the net. Oak Ridge had scored. As his team celebrated on the field, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Principal Collins, her face beaming with pride. "No matter what happens next, Marcus," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you've already won. Look at them. Look at what you've helped them become." Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He watched as his team, rather than getting caught up in individual glory, huddled together, encouraging each other for the final push. The last few minutes of the game were a blur of action. The opposing team, spurred on by Oak Ridge's goal, mounted a furious offensive. Marcus's heart was in his throat as he watched his team defend their lead, each player giving everything they had. And then, finally, the whistle blew. The game was over. Oak Ridge had won, 1-0. The field erupted in chaos as players, parents, and fans all rushed to celebrate. Marcus found himself at the center of a group hug, his players swarming around him, their faces shining with joy and pride. As the initial excitement began to die down, Marcus saw Mr. Harrison approaching, Blake by his side. For a moment, Marcus tensed, unsure of what to expect. But then he saw something he'd never seen before. Mr. Harrison was smiling. "Congratulations, Coach Jackson," Mr. Harrison said, extending his hand. "You've done a hell of a job with these kids." Marcus shook his hand, feeling as if a weight he'd been carrying all season had finally been lifted. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. But the real credit goes to the kids. They're the ones who put in the work, who believe in themselves and each other." Mr. Harrison nodded, looking down at Blake with a mixture of pride and something that looked almost like regret. "You're right about that. And I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you, about your methods. I see now what you've been trying to do here." Before Marcus could respond, he felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Tina, her eyes shining with excitement. Coach, they want us for the trophy presentation." As Marcus allowed himself to be pulled away, he saw Mr. Harrison give him a nod of respect. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, and Marcus knew there was still work to be done to fully bridge the divide. But it was a start. The trophy presentation was a blur of cheers, tears, and triumphant smiles. As Marcus watched his team lift the trophy together, each player insisting that everyone get a chance to hold it, he felt a sense of fulfillment unlike anything he'd experienced before. Later that evening, as the excitement began to die down and families started to head home, Marcus found a quiet moment to himself on the empty field. He sat on the grass, looking out over the pitch where so much had happened over the past few months. He thought about the challenges he'd faced, the moments of doubt and frustration. But more than that, he thought about the transformations he'd witnessed. Tina finding her voice, Carlos learning to channel his energy positively, Blake discovering what it truly meant to be a leader. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw Sarah walking towards him, a soft smile on her face. "There you are," she said, sitting down beside him. "I thought I might find you here." Marcus leaned into her, grateful for her constant support. "Can you believe it, Sarah? Everything that's happened. It's more than I ever dared to hope for when I took this job." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I can believe it. I've always known you had it in you to make a real difference. And now everyone else can see it too." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun begin to set over the field. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "So, what's next? I bet you'll be getting offers from bigger schools after this." Marcus considered her words. It was true. His success with the Oak Ridge team would likely open doors to more prestigious coaching positions. But as he thought about it, he realized something. "You know what?" he said slowly. "I think I'm right where I need to be. These kids, this community, there's still so much work to do here. So much potential to unlock. I'm not ready to leave that behind." Sarah smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I had a feeling you'd say that. And I think you're making the right choice. You're changing lives here, Marcus. Not just on the field, but off it too." As they sat there, watching the sky turn a brilliant orange, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be new challenges to face, new minds to change, new lives to impact. But he was ready for it all. Because here, on this small middle school soccer field, Marcus Jackson had found his true calling. Not just as a coach, but as a mentor, a leader, a force for positive change in his community. And as long as there were kids who needed guidance, who needed someone to believe in them and push them to be their best selves, Marcus knew that this was exactly where he belonged. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. But for Marcus, it felt less like an ending and more like a new beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And he couldn't wait to get started. As Marcus and Sarah walked hand in hand towards the parking lot, he took one last look back at the field. In the gathering dusk, he could almost see the ghosts of the season past. The practices, the games, the moments of triumph and despair. But more than that, he could see the promise of seasons to come. Of lives touched, potentials realized, communities united. And in that moment, Marcus Jackson knew with absolute certainty that he had found his home. Not just in this town or this school, but in the hearts and minds of the young people whose lives he was privileged to be a part of. It wasn't just about soccer. It was about shaping the future, one young life at a time. With a smile on his face and determination in his heart, Marcus turned away from the field and towards the future. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. What would you do if you were in Coach Jackson's shoes, facing unjust criticism simply for doing your job with dedication? Would you have had the courage to stand tall in the face of prejudice and judgment, or would you have handled things differently? If this story of resilience, bravery, and standing up for what's right resonated with you, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put my heart into creating these meaningful narratives, and your support means everything. Thank you for being a part of this journey.